The tragic story of KFC founder Colonel Harland Sanders. Shelbyville estate is not a tale of ghosts or scandals, but a quiet, human tragedy hidden behind brick walls and polished floors. To the world, Sanders was a smiling old man in a white suit, a symbol of fried chicken and American success. But the mansion he lived in during his later years tells a deeper, more complicated story, one shaped by perseverance, sacrifice, and loss. Colonel Sanders spent most of his life struggling. He worked as a farmhand, a railroad laborer, an insurance salesman, and even ran a small service station cafe before anyone knew his name. Success did not come early. In fact, it came so late that most people would have already given up. When fame finally arrived through Kentucky Fried Chicken, it arrived fast, loud, and overwhelming. Shelbyville became a place of retreat for Sanders, a town that offered calm after decades of uncertainty. His mansion there stood as physical proof that persistence could eventually pay off. To outsiders, it looked like a reward, comfort, respect, and stability after a lifetime of hard work. Yet inside, the reality was far less glamorous. By the time Sanders lived there, he had already sold KFC. Although he remained the public face of the brand, control was no longer in his hands. This loss weighed heavily on him. He often criticized the company's direction and felt disconnected from what he had built with his own hands. The mansion, meant to represent victory, instead became a place where pride and regret quietly coexisted. Despite his wealth, Sanders never truly embraced luxury. He preferred simple routines, traditional food, and long conversations over corporate celebrations. The mansion was large, but life inside it could feel lonely. Fame brought constant travel, interviews, and appearances, leaving little room for rest. The very success that built the house also kept him from enjoying it. As time passed, age and health issues began to slow him down. Financial responsibilities, tied to maintaining such a property, added stress rather than comfort. The mansion became less a dream fulfilled and more a reminder of how much had been given up along the way: privacy, control, and peace. Today, the Shelbyville estate stands as a symbol not of failure, but of the hidden cost of success. Colonel Sanders achieved what millions dream of, yet his story reminds us that even the greatest victories can carry quiet sorrow. Behind the legend of KFC lies a man who never stopped working, never stopped caring, and never fully escaped the weight of the life he built. Colonel Harland Sanders did not begin as a wealthy icon. His rise came after decades of failure and hardship, marked by a life that constantly pushed him to the edge of survival rather than success. Born in 1890 in rural Indiana, Sanders lost his father at a young age, forcing him into adulthood far too early. By the age of 6, he was cooking meals for his siblings while his mother worked long hours. This was not the beginning of a dream, but the beginning of endurance. Poverty shaped his character long before ambition ever did. His early adulthood was unstable and restless. Sanders drifted from job to job, never finding lasting security. He worked as a farmhand, a streetcar conductor, a blacksmith's helper, a firefighter, and an insurance salesman. Many of these ventures ended in failure, some due to economic hardship, others due to his own temper and stubborn independence. He was even dismissed from the military after a brief service. Another door closed before it ever fully opened. By his 30s, he had little to show for decades of labor, except experience and frustration. The Great Depression hit Sanders especially hard. Like millions of Americans, he watched opportunities disappear almost overnight. His insurance business collapsed, leaving him nearly penniless. At an age when many people had already settled into stable careers, Sanders was forced to start over once again. He lived out of his car at times, relying on odd jobs and sheer persistence. These years carved deep emotional scars, teaching him resilience, but also bitterness toward failure and wasted effort. It was only in his 40s that Sanders found something resembling direction, running a small service station in Corbin, Kentucky. Even then, success was not immediate. He cooked meals not out of vision, but necessity, serving travelers because it helped keep the lights on. His fried chicken gained local popularity, but disasters followed. A fire destroyed his restaurant, and later, a new highway rerouted traffic away from his business, effectively killing it. Years of work vanished again, reinforcing a painful pattern. Whenever he built something, it was taken from him. At 60, 5 years old, an age when most people retire, Sanders was nearly broke once more. With little savings and only a small Social Security check, he took to the road, sleeping in his car and pitching his fried chicken recipe to restaurant owners one by one. Rejection became routine. Many laughed at him. Others shut the door in his face. He was not chasing wealth at this stage. He was fighting irrelevance, refusing to let his life end as a record of unrealized effort. Even when Kentucky Fried Chicken finally began to grow, the scars of hardship never left him. Sanders distrusted comfort because comfort had never lasted. Every achievement felt temporary, every victory fragile. The white suit and confident smile masked decades of insecurity built from repeated loss. He carried with him the memory of hunger, instability, and failure, shaping how he viewed success, not as a reward, but as something that had to be defended relentlessly. His late success was not the product of luck or sudden brilliance, but of exhaustion that refused to surrender. Sanders did not rise because life favored him. He rose because he outlasted defeat. The weight of those decades, missed chances, financial ruin, broken ventures, never truly lifted, even when fame arrived. They remained embedded in his identity, influencing every decision, every fear, and every restless moment that followed. Shelbyville represented a quieter, later chapter of his life, far from the neon lights of KFC fame, and deliberately removed from the noise that now followed his name everywhere he went. By the time Harland Sanders settled there, he was no longer chasing recognition or survival. The struggle that defined his early decades had finally eased. But in its place came something more complicated: reflection. Shelbyville was not chosen for opportunity or expansion. It was chosen for distance. Distance from corporate boardrooms, advertising campaigns, and a brand that had grown so large it no longer fully belonged to him. In Shelbyville, Sanders lived at a slower pace, surrounded by routine rather than applause. The town offered familiarity and predictability, qualities he had rarely known in his earlier life. While KFC signs glowed across highways and cities, Shelbyville remained modest and understated, mirroring Sanders' own preferences. He had never been comfortable with extravagance, and despite his wealth, he still favored simple meals, plain clothing, and long conversations over spectacle. This period of his life was shaped by contradiction. He was one of the most recognizable businessmen in America. Yet in Shelbyville he could walk without ceremony, known more as a local figure than a global symbol. Fame followed him, but it softened there. The mansion he occupied was not meant to impress the world. It was meant to provide stillness. It became a place where he could pause after decades of constant motion. A rare luxury for a man who had spent most of his life on the road. Yet the quiet carried its own weight. Removed from the day-to-day operations of KFC, Sanders often felt detached from the company that defined his identity. Shelbyville gave him peace, but it also gave him time to think, to remember, and to question decisions he could no longer undo. Without the constant urgency of survival or expansion, memories resurfaced more vividly: the failures, the sacrifices, and the moments where control slipped from his grasp. Shelbyville was also where aging became impossible to ignore. Away from crowds and stages, Sanders confronted the limits of his own body and energy. The routines that once fueled him, traveling, promoting, persuading, were now physically demanding. The town became a setting where the man behind the legend had to accept vulnerability, something he had resisted his entire life. In this quieter chapter, Sanders was no longer building something new. He was living alongside what he had already built, trying to make peace with it. Shelbyville did not erase the noise of fame, but it softened it enough for him to hear his own thoughts. It was a place of rest, but also of reckoning. A calm landscape that allowed the complexities of his life to finally catch up with him. The mansion symbolized success, but it also reflected loneliness, aging, and the cost of relentless ambition. Standing as a quiet monument to a life spent constantly moving forward with little time to look back. On the surface, the estate represented everything Colonel Harland Sanders had once believed would bring fulfillment, security, respect, and proof that his struggles had not been in vain. After decades of instability, the mansion appeared to confirm that perseverance had finally been rewarded. Yet success, when it arrived so late, carried a different emotional weight than expected. The size of the mansion often emphasized absence rather than comfort. Large rooms echoed with stillness, reminding Sanders that the battles of his life had been fought largely alone. His rise had required constant travel, long separations, and an almost obsessive focus on work. Relationships were often secondary to survival and ambition, and by the time he could afford such a home, many of the connections that might have filled it had already faded or grown distant. Aging intensified this sense of isolation. The mansion, once imagined as a place of rest, gradually became a reminder of physical limitations. Stairs grew steeper, routines slower, and the energy that once carried him across states and kitchens began to wane. The house did not adapt to him, he had to adapt to it. In its quiet halls, Sanders confronted the reality that success had arrived at a stage of life when time, not money, was the rarest resource. The mansion also reflected the emotional cost of relentless ambition. For most of his life, Sanders had defined himself by persistence, by the refusal to stop, no matter how many times he failed. That mindset built an empire, but it left little room for stillness or contentment. Inside the mansion, surrounded by symbols of achievement, he often remained restless, unable to fully enjoy what he had earned. Ambition, once necessary for survival, had become a habit he could not easily abandon. Despite wealth, Sanders continued to live simply, almost cautiously, as if luxury might disappear the way so many opportunities had earlier in his life. The mansion never felt fully claimed as a reward. Instead, it stood as evidence of how much effort had been required to reach that point. Every room reflected not just success, but the years of exhaustion, rejection, and sacrifice that preceded it. In the end, the mansion was less a sanctuary than a mirror. It showed Sanders the full cost of his journey, the victories he achieved, the solitude he endured, and the time he could never recover. What appeared to the world as a symbol of triumph quietly revealed the truth that ambition, when pursued without pause, often demands more than it ever gives back. Despite global recognition, Sanders lived simply and remained deeply attached to traditional Southern values, shaping his daily life in ways that often surprised those who expected luxury and extravagance. Wealth and fame never erased the habits formed during decades of poverty and uncertainty. He continued to value practicality over display, comfort over status, and routine over indulgence. Even as his image became internationally famous, his personal life remained grounded in modesty and familiarity. Sanders believed strongly in self-reliance, hospitality, and respect, principles rooted in Southern culture and reinforced by his early upbringing. He took pride in manners, storytelling, and shared meals, seeing food not as a product but as a gesture of care. Cooking, for him, was personal. The act of preparing food carried meaning beyond profit, reflecting traditions passed down through generations. This mindset clashed sharply with the increasingly corporate nature of the fast food industry that grew around his name. His clothing choices reflected this simplicity. While the white suit became a public symbol, it was less a costume of luxury and more a uniform of consistency. It represented order and identity rather than excess. At home, he favored plain meals, straightforward routines, and familiar comforts. He had little interest in extravagant decor or modern trends, preferring surroundings that felt honest and unpretentious. Southern values also shaped his sense of loyalty and stubbornness. Sanders respected tradition and resisted change, especially when it conflicted with what he believed was the right way of doing things. This often put him at odds with corporate executives who prioritized efficiency and expansion over craftsmanship. He was deeply critical of shortcuts, especially when they altered the taste or preparation of his chicken. To him, quality was a matter of pride, not branding. His simplicity extended to how he viewed success itself. Sanders did not see wealth as a license to distance himself from ordinary people. He enjoyed conversation with strangers, treated employees with familiarity, and valued personal reputation more than public image. In private moments, he remained the same man shaped by hardship, distrustful of comfort and aware of how easily stability could vanish. This attachment to traditional values gave Sanders a sense of identity, even as the world around him changed rapidly. It anchored him emotionally, offering continuity in a life marked by disruption and late success. While the brand evolved into something vast and impersonal, Sanders held onto the principles that had carried him through failure and survival. His simplicity was not an affectation. It was a lifelong instinct, rooted in a culture that valued dignity, hard work, and staying true to oneself, no matter how far success reached. The estate witnessed both pride in achievement and frustration over losing control of his own brand, becoming a silent observer of the emotional conflict that defined Colonel Harland Sanders' later years. Within its walls, moments of deep satisfaction coexisted with lingering resentment. Sanders had built something from nothing, transforming a roadside recipe into a global name, and that reality filled him with undeniable pride. Yet the very scale of that success also marked the point where his personal authority faded, leaving him emotionally divided between accomplishment and regret. In private, Sanders often reflected on how far he had come. The estate stood as proof that his persistence had not been meaningless. Every brick and quiet room represented decades of struggle, rejection, and endurance. He had outlived failure, outworked doubt, and achieved recognition at an age when most people are forgotten. This knowledge gave him a sense of validation that no corporate title could replace. At the same time, the estate became a place where his frustration grew sharper. After selling Kentucky Fried Chicken, Sanders retained his image and title, but decision-making power slipped from his hands. Recipes were altered, processes were streamlined, and priorities shifted toward mass production. From the comfort of his estate, he watched the brand evolve into something he barely recognized. What had once been personal craftsmanship became standardized business, and that loss felt deeply personal. The distance from corporate headquarters intensified this frustration. Letters, phone calls, and news reports replaced direct involvement. Sanders was consulted as a symbol, not as a creator. He felt reduced to a mascot for a company that no longer welcomed his opinions. The estate, meant to be a refuge, often amplified these feelings by giving him time and space to dwell on what he could no longer influence. Despite his anger, Sanders never disowned his creation. Pride and frustration existed side by side. He defended the brand publicly, even when privately critical of its direction. The estate hosted conversations where he praised his legacy in one moment and condemned corporate decisions in the next. This emotional contradiction became a defining feature of his later life. The estate thus became more than a residence. It became a place of reckoning. It held the satisfaction of knowing he had achieved something extraordinary, and the pain of knowing it no longer fully belonged to him. In that tension, Sanders lived out his final years, caught between the joy of success and the cost of surrendering control over the very thing that defined his life. Financial pressures, changing business realities, and health issues shadowed his later years there, quietly shaping daily life in ways that were far less visible than his public image. Although Colonel Harland Sanders was widely perceived as wealthy, the reality was more complex. Maintaining an estate required constant expenses, staff, upkeep, taxes, and repairs that did not disappear with age. Wealth brought responsibility, not freedom, and even in comfort, Sanders remained cautious with money, shaped by decades of instability and loss. The business world around him was also changing rapidly. The fast food industry he helped pioneer had become increasingly corporate, data-driven, and impersonal. Decisions were no longer made in kitchens or by taste, but in boardrooms guided by efficiency and profit margins. Sanders struggled with this shift. He believed strongly in hands-on involvement and craftsmanship, values that felt increasingly out of place in an era of mass franchising. Watching this transformation from a distance created a sense of disconnection, as though the world had moved on without him. Health issues added another layer of difficulty. Aging brought physical limitations that Sanders could not outwork or outlast. Travel became exhausting, recovery slower, and the stamina that once carried him across countless states began to fade. Illnesses and fatigue restricted his independence, forcing him to rely on others in ways that conflicted with his lifelong self-reliance. The estate, once imagined as a place of rest, sometimes felt confining rather than comforting. These pressures fed into one another. Health limitations reduced his ability to remain actively involved, while business changes made his opinions feel less relevant. Financial obligations demanded attention even as his energy declined. The combination created a persistent undercurrent of stress, despite the outward appearance of success and stability. In quieter moments at the estate, Sanders faced the reality that achievement did not shield him from the ordinary vulnerabilities of aging. Fame could not restore health, nor could wealth reverse time. The later years there were marked by a constant balancing act, managing responsibilities, preserving dignity, and adapting to a world that no longer required his constant presence. Beneath the calm exterior of the estate, these unseen pressures followed him, shaping his final chapter with a mix of endurance, frustration, and quiet resilience. The decline of the mansion mirrors the bittersweet truth behind the American dream. Success does not guarantee peace, and achievement alone cannot protect a person from loss, change, or regret. What once stood as a proud symbol of arrival gradually revealed the fragility of material success. As time passed, the estate aged alongside its owner, reflecting not only physical wear, but the emotional toll of a life spent striving without pause. The mansion was built on the promise that perseverance leads to fulfillment, a belief deeply woven into the American dream. Yet fulfillment proved more complicated than success itself. The walls that once represented safety and reward began to feel heavy with memory. Each room carried echoes of battles won and sacrifices made, reminding Sanders that the price of success is often paid long before its rewards are felt. As the years went on, maintaining the mansion became more difficult, and its grandeur slowly faded. What had once symbolized permanence now required constant attention, mirroring the reality that success is not a final state but an ongoing responsibility. The decline was not sudden or dramatic. It was gradual and quiet, much like the emotional wear that follows decades of relentless ambition. This deterioration reflected a deeper truth. The American dream celebrates achievement, but rarely addresses what comes after. Sanders reached the peak late in life, when the energy to enjoy it was limited and reflection came easily. The mansion, once imagined as a place of rest, became a reminder that peace cannot be purchased or postponed until success is achieved. The contrast between the dream and the reality grew sharper as time passed. Fame brought recognition, but not contentment. Wealth provided comfort, but not clarity. The mansion stood as proof that while ambition can build empires, it cannot guarantee inner calm. In its decline, the estate quietly revealed that the ultimate promise of the American dream is incomplete, because success, no matter how extraordinary, does not ensure peace, fulfillment, or rest. In the end, the story of Colonel Harland Sanders and his Shelbyville estate is not one of failure, but of truth. It reminds us that behind every celebrated success stands a human life shaped by sacrifice, endurance, and unanswered questions. The mansion may have risen as proof that persistence can overcome adversity, but its quiet decline reveals something far more honest. That achievement does not erase struggle, it simply changes its shape. Sanders' life shows us that the American dream can deliver success, But peace must be found elsewhere. And perhaps the greatest legacy he leaves behind is not a recipe or a brand, but a reminder that ambition should build a life worth living, not just a name the world remembers.